It is my pleasure to introduce to you our first two presenters today. Pastor Chick Lane and Duddy Pomroy bring a fresh perspective together because they challenge our assumptions that one size fits all when it comes to stewardship practices. And the fact that some would see their partnership as unlikely across the ages also reveals our assumptions we carry about generational separation. Pastor Chick's experience and wisdom runs deep, tracing a history as a congregational pastor, assistant to the bishop, and both consultant and director for several significant stewardship programs. He now serves as the pastor for stewardship and generosity. How's that for a job title? And that is at Lord of Life Lutheran Church in Maple Grove, Minnesota. Pastor of generosity. I think that's an aspirational goal for me someday. He's also the author of several books, including a book entitled Ask, Thank, Tell. And I mentioned this to him earlier, but that book transformed my previous congregation. So to Pastor Chick, thank you for your depth of wisdom and experience that you bring today. Duddy Pomroy brings a breadth of experience, so we have both the depth and the breadth today. She speaks as a millennial stewardship leader. Her journey has brought her from Luther Seminary to being the director of operations for Kairos and Associates and the Joshua Group, to now serving as the financial education specialist at Portico Benefit Services. Her wisdom emanates not only from those experiences, but from her ability to draw connections where others assume there might not be. Together, these two have written a book entitled Embracing Stewardship, How to Put Stewardship at the Heart of Your Congregation's Life. And today, their presentation for us has a fantastic title, What's Old, What's New, and What's Right for You? Now, I won't presume to tell you which one of these people are bringing the older perspective and which one's bringing the newer perspective. I do know earlier they told me the age difference between them is 40 years, and part of the year it's only 39 years, and Pastor Chick said that's his favorite part of the year. But I do know this. I know that the wisdom each one carries, and more importantly, the wisdom that emerges between them is going to be a blessing to us today. Let's welcome Pastor Chick Lane and Duddy Pomroy.
As you heard, our title is Stewardship, What's Old, What's New, and What's Right for You, and that's pretty much the outline of how we're going to move through the next hour. What's old, first, might actually sound fairly new, but as you'll quickly recognize, it's old. It's as old as the Scriptures, but it sounds new because of the way in so many of our congregations we have talked about stewardship for the last years, decades, perhaps more. I think that in most congregations, stewardship, the word, functions as a code word. And what it really means when people say it is, these are the things that we do to get money from members to the congregation to get the bills paid. And when people hear the word stewardship, that's what they think. For members of the congregation, another way to say it might be, stewardship is what my congregation does to get some of the money out of my pocket and into the offering plate. And for congregational leaders, the church council types, when they use the word stewardship, it's often in the context of these are the things that we do to make sure that we get enough money to pay the bills. And we know at the end of the year, if we've had a good year in stewardship, by do we have more money than bills, or do we have more bills than money? Because of that understanding of stewardship, which I'm convinced is still really prevalent, what we're about to talk about may sound new, but obviously it isn't. I want to talk about just two phrases that I think are absolutely vital if we are going to understand what the Bible has to say about our lives as stewards. The first is, it all belongs to God. We do pretty well with that when we think big picture. I remember being at Bible camp and singing, He's got the whole world in His hands. And when we think big like that, then it's all God's. But what the Bible says is more than that. It says that everything that we think we have, everything that we think we own, we really don't. It's God's. And as that gets more personal, it gets tougher. So this, and all that it represents, not mine, but God's. And this, my car key and my house key and my office key, that stuff is not mine, it's God's. Where the Bible has us understand that, we could look at lots of places, but just 2 Psalms very quickly. First of all, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it, for he has founded it on the seas and established it on the rivers. The word for is really important there. How can we say that all of this is God's? Because he created it. So the Bible makes the creator-owner connection. Another psalm makes the same point. Psalm 89, the heavens are yours. This is addressed to God. The earth also is yours. The world and all that is in it, you have founded it. Again, creator-owner connection. It all belongs to God because God made it. A number of years ago, when I was on synod staff in northwestern Minnesota, we had Harry Wendt, who many of you I'm sure are aware of, come for an event and talk about stewardship. Well, I was the stewardship guy on the staff, so I got to do devotions and introduce Harry. And I remember thinking as I was preparing, I want Harry to know that I know what I'm talking about. So several times during my devotions, I said, and everything we have is a gift from God. Everything we have is a gift from God. After I did my devotions, Harry took me aside and said, Chick, you need to be careful about that word gift. God doesn't give gifts. And I gave him my absolute best dumb look because I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. And if you know Harry at all, you know that it wouldn't have mattered what look I gave him. He just kept right on going. And he said, when we think of giving gifts, we think of a transfer of ownership. With God, there's no transfer of ownership. God doesn't give gifts. When I used to travel a lot when I worked for the ELCA Churchwide, my son seemed to think that most of the reason for my travel was to play golf. And so he said to me, Dad, when you're out traveling and you're playing some really nice golf courses, get me some logo golf balls. Those are logo golf balls. Well, I hardly ever played golf, but once out in western North Dakota, I did. I went to Bully Pulpit Golf Course, and there on the counter in the pro shop, they had a logo golf ball, and I thought of my son, and I bought it. And I understood that a transfer of ownership had occurred. I gave them $14 for this 50-cent golf ball, and they had my money, and I had the golf ball. I could do with it what I wanted because it was mine now. Well, obviously what I wanted to do was give it to my son. So the next time I saw him, I gave him the logo golf ball and said, here's that logo golf ball you were wanting. At that point, we understood that another transfer of ownership had occurred. It was his now. He could do with it whatever he wanted. I hoped that out of his love for good old Dad, he'd put it in his logo golf ball case. But he didn't have to. If he wanted to go to the park and practice hitting some shots, he could have taken my 50-cent golf ball with a logo on it. It was his to do with as he wished. Harry's point to me is that it's never like that with God and us. The stuff is never ours to do with as we wish. It always is still God's. And the question we need to ask is not, what do I want to do with this, but rather, what would God have me do with this? In chapel, when I was working at Lutheran Seminary, one of the students was leading morning prayer, and she was supposed to say, into your hands we commend ourselves, our bodies, our souls, and all that is ours. What she said was, on the right, into your hands we commend ourselves, our bodies, our souls, and all that is yours. I'm a good Lutheran, so I had my head down, and when she said yours, I think I threw my neck out. I jerked up so fast, because she was right. She improved on that old prayer, because all that we have really is God's. So, it all belongs to God. And then the second point that I want to make is we are stewards. The word steward means that we don't own it. A steward is that person who takes care of something that belongs to someone else. If you're the owner, you can't be the steward. So we don't know it for sure very often, but every time we use the word steward, we're acknowledging that God owns it. and our job is to take care of it. Two passages. First, from 1 Corinthians 4. Think of us in this way, as servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. The steward is like the chief financial officer of the household. If that person is not trustworthy, that person is in a position to do significant damage. And 1 Peter 4, like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. A steward exists not for self-enrichment, but to serve the other. Douglas John Hall has written a couple of marvelous books on stewardship, and in both of them, he talks about the fact that as stewards, and I hate to say God's up there and we're down here, but it works. As stewards, we have an accountability to the owner. That's the vertical dimension of stewardship. We have an accountability back to God. That was the first passage. And we also have a responsibility for the created order to care for it as stewards. So biblically, we start with the idea that we are stewards. The word probably comes from these guys, steward, and there's some scholarly debate that's way over my head about whether this is true or not, but steward was the person who cared for the pigs, the warden of the sty. So, steward, it's an important, prestigious role. I like to think of it this way, that God thinks so highly of each one of us that God entrusts some of what God owns into our care, our management, our stewardship. So for me, the starting point biblically is it all belongs to God, and we are stewards.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Chick, for getting us started there. We're going to continue taking a look at what's old just for a minute here, and we're going to go into another biblical passage. Often the joke that Chick and I have between each other is that for him, stewardship is about money and a whole lot more. And for me, stewardship is about money and a whole lot more. So you're going to see an expansive view of stewardship in my lens here. And I believe that this is a thoroughly old way to see stewardship and discipleship. One of my favorite activities that I love to do with people in groups like this is to ask people what word comes to mind for them or image comes to mind when you think of stewardship. Now, we have a large group in a short amount of time, so sadly we can't go around the room and hear what you have to say. But I'm wondering if you could shout out for me, if people from your congregation were in here in the room today, what word do you think would come to mind immediately for them? Money. Absolutely. Money is the word that comes to mind for most folks. I agree completely with Chick that stewardship is so often a code word in our world today. And that's why we wanted to make sure we started by explaining to you what stewardship means to us. Stewardship to me is not really that much about money. Money is one piece of the puzzle. In fact, stewardship at its core for me is about love. A few years ago, I was invited to write a resource for ELCA Churchwide, and I decided to call it Stewards of God's Love. As I was writing it, I was thinking about what does stewardship really mean to me? I've been borrowing definitions from my friend Chick and so many other great stewardship leaders for so long. I love the definition that's attributed to Clarence Stoughton that stewardship is everything I do after I say I believe. It's about so much more than just money. It's the way we live our life. Yet I kept coming back in my head to the passage from Luke chapter 10 of the Good Samaritan, of the call to love God with our whole selves. So that's what I want to go through with you today, is the Good Samaritan passage. Now, I realize that many of you are probably sitting here thinking, Grace, I have studied this passage for probably as long as you've been alive. What possibly could you have to tell me that's new about this? Well, first of all, I think thinking of it as a stewardship passage may be new to many of you in the room. I think the Good Samaritan could have just as likely been called the Good Steward. But I also think there's a twist at the end that you may not have ever seen before. So I hope that you'll bear with me as we go through this passage and explore what it means for stewardship ministry. Just so we can all hear a fresh perspective here, we're going to read it out loud together. And I promise you it's not an eye test. The text does get smaller as we go along, so just be warned. Just be warned. So I invite you to read this with me section by section, and then I will delineate some specific points on each section of the passage. So please join me. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." Let's begin by just talking about what verses the lawyer is pointing to here. As we know, and as I'm sure many of you in the room are very familiar with this, that beginning passage is coming from Deuteronomy chapter 6. The Shema, the core, the centerpiece of the Hebrew faith. This is something that lawyer had quoted over and over and over again. This is nothing new. This is what's old. Looking again at the second part of that passage, it comes from Leviticus chapter 19. Again, this is old news. What I want to point out to you here is what the word love means in this context. The word love in our world today, I would say, means almost nothing. In the same sentence, I can say I love spaghetti and meatballs, and I love my husband. Although some days I feel like that love is quite similar. It's really not. What we're talking about in the Hebrew sensibility here, love being complete commitment, devotion, and loyalty. So when you hear the word love, think about loyalty, commitment, and devotion. It's more similar to the love that I have for my husband. I love the way that Alan Culpepper puts this in the New Interpreter's Bible. The importance of these qualifiers is to plant the flag of God's sovereignty over the whole of one's life. God's claim on us reaches to every area of our experience, to our innermost being, our heart, to our lives, what gives us our individual identity, our soul, our energy, our strength, resolves, and resources, our might, and our understanding and intellectual capacities, our mind. No part of ourselves is to be withheld from God. What a high standard of what stewardship could be about. I think if many people in our congregations heard this, they might be tempted to turn and run, but this is exactly what stewardship at its core demands of us. Not just to put money in the offering plate so we don't feel guilty, but to show up with our whole life, our whole selves, all that God has entrusted to our care. Stewardship to me is the way in which we use all of the resources that God has entrusted to our care to love God and our neighbor. Stewardship to me is love in action. It's not just talking the talk, but walking the walk with all that God has entrusted to us. Now, of course, we know the passage does not end here, because we get the wonderful question of who is my neighbor. Please join me in reading the next section. Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity." Let me set the stage for you here. This road from Jerusalem to Jericho was not the place where you took your Sunday sweetheart on a stroll. This was one of the most dangerous roads in the ancient world. You were going from point A to point B as quickly as possible. Now, we could stand around here all day debating why the priest and the Levite didn't stop, and many scholars have spent their time on that. I will spare you from that. I will spare you from that conversation. Instead, I want to offer you one suggestion as to why they didn't stop, and it has to do with the verb to see. I want to suggest to you that the priest and the Levite saw this man as a burden, something getting in the way of their journey from point A to point B, maybe even as a cautionary tale of the dangers that they already knew were present on this road. On the other hand, the Samaritan also sees this man. He doesn't just see him. He comes close, and he's moved with pity or compassion. The Good Samaritan sees this man not as a burden, not as a sign of those dangers, but as another man just like himself in need of care. Let's see how the story continues to play out. Please read with me again.
He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend."
The Good Samaritan does not just throw money at the man by the side of the road. He does not just bandage his wounds and walk away. Instead, he shows up offering his whole self to his neighbor's care, a neighbor that many would say in that culture and time was an enemy. The reason why I've bolded those words is it shows all of the actions that the Good Samaritan took. He comes close. He's moved with compassion. He goes to him. He bandages his wounds, offering his skills. He offers his possessions. He brings him to an inn, detouring from his point A to point B road that he was on that day. And only then does the money come in. Only then do we hear about the 2 denarii and the blank check that he writes for this man. I think the most revolutionary piece of this passage is the time that this man offers. As an incredibly type A person, only potentially to be beat by my cohort, Chick Lane over here, I can't imagine stopping my journey on a dangerous road for the sake of my neighbor, someone that I didn't even know, taking this type of a detour and letting their needs lead the way through my day instead of my own to-do list. It's an incredibly challenging example of stewardship of time. Now, up until about a year ago, I stopped the passage right there. When I wrote Stewards of God's Love, I thought, wow, what a great example. The Good Samaritan, like any good superhero, swings in, offering great stewardship to this man in need. What a triumphant story. But there's more here, and that's what I'm most excited to share with you. Please finish the passage with me. Which of these three do you think
was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise."
Did you notice that Jesus changed the question as he so often likes to do? The question that the lawyer asked was, who is my neighbor? He's looking at a noun. Does it just include the guy next door, the guy 2 streets over, the people in my community, those from Samaria? And yet the question that Jesus wants to know the answer to is who was a neighbor? Who acted as a neighbor? Now you might say, Grace, it is a Thursday morning. I'm not into the semantics here. Tell me what difference this really makes. It changes everything in this story. Because you see, if Jesus wanted to answer the lawyer's question plain and simple, wouldn't he have made the story about the good Israelite and the beaten man by the side of the road, the Samaritan, so that the lawyer could walk away saying, okay, I get it, Jesus. The Samaritans are included. We'll see what I can do. Instead, because no ethnicity is given for that beaten man by the side of the road, we can only assume that he is the Israelite, and the Samaritan is the one offering the care. I think Jesus is calling us to imagine ourselves not as the Good Samaritan, or at least not yet, but as the beaten man by the side of the road. Us stewardship leaders are so often talking about how to give stewardship. We don't often talk about what it means to be the receiver of someone else's good stewardship. What does it mean to be the beaten man by the side of the road and be stewarded to? And how does that experience change everything in terms of stewardship ministry? About a year ago, when I found out this twist in the passage here, one of my best friends from college had just passed away unexpectedly. My best friend Claire had been in my wedding just a year prior. She was 28 years old, completely healthy, and within a week of being in the hospital, she was gone. I felt like the beaten man by the side of the road, left for dead. And I'm sure many of you understand how that feels. And people came out of the woodworks that I never would have expected to be good stewards to me. A friend of mine called me up and said, Grace, I want to bring you a donut. I know you probably don't want to see me or open your door. I'm just going to bring it right to your doorstep. Friends sent me cards. They sent me Facebook messages. They did everything that they could to illustrate their love and care for me. People I never expected came out of the woodworks. And it changed the way I saw stewardship, because I began to realize as I'd known for so long, that it's about God and not about us. It's about the many things that God has done for us, and only out of that experience of vulnerability can we really see the people that we serve not as a burden, but as another person just like us in need of care. I love the way that David Lose puts this in Working Preacher, and I'm just going to share with you that last piece. Might we see ourselves, that is, as those who, having recognized ourselves as the traveler left for dead by the side of the road, can now arise to reach out to serve others. Stewardship is a classic story of death and resurrection. Death and resurrection. Only after we have been that beaten man can we arise to serve others as the Good Samaritan.
Thanks. Now we're going to move to what's new. And I want to start with the claim that I'm convinced is true, that for most of us in most of our congregations, we can no longer assume that we are the number one priority for the members of the congregation for their giving. And I'm convinced that the greater the giving capacity that people have, the more likely it is that that's going to be true. Now, there was a day, right? I can remember when the two main giving options that most people had were the church and the United Way. And that was it. I'm old. Grace can't remember that day. But some of you can. The church and the United Way. That day, as you know, is long gone. And there are many, many, many wonderful Christian ministries that have fairly sophisticated development staffs that are reaching out to the members of your congregation and inviting their financial support. We know that to be a reality. What's happened as a result of that, in study after study, is that the local congregation's slice of the charitable giving pie has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm convinced that God wants each of our congregations to dream big. And I know lots of congregations who can't dream at all because they are so constrained by a lack of financial resources to do what they're convinced God is calling them to do that they simply are stuck. So what can you do? I'd like to suggest some practices for congregational stewardship ministry in the next few minutes. First, I think we need to look at those people who are doing this well and say, what are they doing? What is it that the college that I attended, the seminary that I attended, are doing well to invite me to support them generously? And what can I adapt from that to the work that I'm doing in a congregation? What can we learn? The sentence on the right, as I typed it and as I thought about it, it's a bit bold, maybe a bit brash, but I think it's true. That if you do nothing to cultivate the generosity of your members, you are dooming yourself to having too little to do what God is calling you to do. I've talked to so many pastors who are bemoaning the fact that there's just not enough money to do the ministry that the congregation wants to do. And I'll ask them, so tell me, what are you doing to encourage members to be more generous? And often the answer is, well, really not much. Well, should we be surprised? So I think if we aren't engaging people in our congregations, encouraging them to grow in generosity, it's not surprising that we don't have enough to do what we think God is calling us to do. There's an important reality that you in your local congregation have that almost any other nonprofit would give their right arm for. And that is, and I hate to use the word donor of members, but it's the fundraising language and it seemed to fit here. You have donor exposure and donor loyalty like nobody else. You have members of your congregation coming together for worship every week, or in the case of Lord of Life, every other week or so. But you have people coming. They know about your congregation. More than that, you have members who have had their most significant life events connected to your congregation. Their kids being baptized, their wedding, family funerals. The list goes on and on and on. You have an incredible love shown to you by the members of your congregation. I've served on Synod, which is ELCA jargon. I think the same jargon in Missouri and Wisconsin would be district. I've served on that staff. I've served on our national staff. And I know from experience that a lot of people don't really love the middle judicatory or the national church. At best, sometimes it feels like they tolerate us, but they love their local congregation. And this is the reason. So we've got a built-in advantage as congregational leaders to appeal to people's generosity that nobody else has. Nobody can come close to this. So what might you do? What might this look like? 4 quick things. First of all, talk about money biblically. Don't just talk about it when you're asking for some. Mark Allen Powell claims that God cares about how we acquire, regard, manage, and spend money. Nice little acronym, ARM. Acquire, regard, manage, and spend. Talk about those things. Take a look at the scriptures and see the breadth of material that is there, where Jesus in particular is trying to help people live responsibly with money as followers of his. Also, talk about money missionally. When you talk about money, connect it back to the mission of the congregation. What is it that you understand God is calling you to do, and what does my giving to your congregation have to do about that? Make that connection for me. Second, ask boldly and effectively. I've seen too many people get up and get to the point where they're actually going to ask people to make a gift to the congregation, and their voice goes like this and their eyes go like this. And if you believe in the mission of your congregation, invite people in. Let them know that God's work is done because of their giving, and invite them to give generously. Third, thank regularly. I like to think of thanking generally and thanking specifically. By generally, I mean the whole congregation, or at least a lot of people at one time. How is it in your congregation that you are thanking people for the ministry that you're able to do together and their part in that, both in terms of their time, their talents, and their treasure? At Lord of Life, we have a 30-second Thanksgiving moment in worship every week. We highlight one ministry that we've done together, sometime local, sometime around the world, sometime someplace else in Minneapolis, and we always say thank you. Because of you, we're able to do that. Thank you. That's the general. The specific is one-on-one. I think, and I know that this is hotly contested among clergy, but I think that pastors ought to know what people give. And I think that pastors ought to know who proportionately are the most generous people in the congregation, and those people ought to know that their pastor knows and appreciates that. That's the kind of specific thanking that I have in mind. Not making a big deal about it, but just saying a heartfelt thank you. And then finally, tell your story often. One of the mistakes that I see a lot of congregations making is that we make the assumption that everybody knows what our congregation is doing. Especially, I think this understanding is more common in smaller congregations. Well, there's not so many of us, everybody knows what we're doing. They probably don't. They'd probably like to. And you can be doing them a big favor in connecting their offerings with the ministry of your congregation by telling them. So, talk about money biblically and missionally, and then, not surprisingly, ask, thank, and tell effectively. And if we had 3 weeks, I'd love to go into much more depth with that. But Grace is walking up here, which means I need to hand off this.
So continuing on with the what's new. And continuing specifically on with what Chick was just talking about how we have to make the case because we're no longer number one, I would recommend to you that you start with why. Why should someone give? And even more, the bigger question, why church? So let's delve into this why question for a few minutes here. I love this TED Talk by Simon Sinek, and I believe he has a book to the same effect about why. He begins his TED Talk by talking about the golden circle. Now, he's speaking about fundraising, and I know we might have some shyness about putting fundraising language into our stewardship conversation, but bear with me on the example. He said that when most people are talking about their product, they're advertising their product, they start with what their product is, maybe a little bit about how it was made or how you might use it, and then just maybe they might get to the why. He suggests that we ought to reverse that a little bit. Start with why it's important, how it was made, and then get into the what. Now, you might think that's a little bit strange, but you're probably more familiar with this type of advertising than you think. Any of you ever seen a commercial for an Apple product? I know that my husband and I were watching the Super Bowl this past year, and we saw a commercial about an Apple product. We didn't know it was about that, and we were so enthralled with the story that was being told that we wondered, what is this product about? We just couldn't wait to go out and buy it. And then at the end, we realized it was just an iPhone. Really? An iPhone? I thought I was supposed to be able to change the status quo. I was going to go out and change the world. I want to be a world changer. I want that product. I'm not quite convinced that an iPhone can do that, but maybe some of you want to take that up with me after I get done speaking. Apple has a why story that is a little bit artificial. The church has a why story that's real. Simon Sinek says that people don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. So I encourage you, do you know your why? Does your congregation or ministry setting know your why? Your purpose, your cause or belief that inspires you to do what you do. I thoroughly recommend to you this book by Cliff Christopher. If you've not read it yet, Not Your Parents' Offering Plate. It's a wonderful resource. In this, he talks specifically about what Chick was just mentioning, that competition between churches and other nonprofits out there. He also stresses the want and desire of people to be able to see the impact of their giving. They want to know how their giving is making a difference in the world. And he says the number one reason that people give is belief in the mission. Now let's be clear about that word mission. Often when I say mission in congregations, people have in mind that mission statement that nobody quite knows exactly what it means, that's sitting on top of your congregational paperwork, or maybe is knitted onto a tapestry in your fellowship hall. You know what I'm talking about. That's not what we're talking about up here. I'm talking about the real mission, living and breathing mission of your congregation or ministry setting. If I were to stop people as they came in the door on Sunday morning and said, why church? Why are you here at St. John's by the freeway? What is God up to in this place? What would they have to say to me? What is your why? So I decided I wanted to explore this why question. I think we can often learn a lot from nonprofits. Even more sometimes we can learn from how churches are doing this well. So I decided to do a little research and went on the website of Charity Water. I kid you not, it was the first nonprofit website I went to because I wanted to see if they were playing around with this why question at all. I went on there because Charity Water was kind of the in vogue charity at the time. All of the celebrities were giving to Charity Water a few years ago. If you're not familiar with it, here's a bit about their mission. They're a nonprofit organization bringing clean and safe drinking water to people in developing nations. Now this sounds like a really great mission, I would say, but I have to be truthful with you. When I think about the places that I would like to give to, the things that rise to the top for me are education, economic inequality, and women's issues, and sustainability. Those are the things that my husband and I really care about. So when I saw this statement, I thought, that's great, it's wonderful that Charity Water is doing this mission in the world. I don't think my dollars are going to be going there. Stumbled onto their website and immediately saw on the top bar that they had a Why Water section. It was just right there, waiting for me to find. And I jump into the Why Water section and I see that statement up there. Clean water means health, education, and income, especially for women and kids. Wow, you've really hit on all my hot button issues. And then I watched this video about how water changes everything. How water coming to this community really does allow kids to be able to get the education they need, to bring income back to their villages. It changes the whole story for them. I tell you, I couldn't part with my money fast enough. I began to realize that water for them is the what. It's just the medium with which they are able to complete their why. It was mentioned earlier in my bio that I used to work for a church consulting firm, and one of my big roles there was going onto church websites. When someone would call us and say they wanted to work with Kairos and Associates, I was the one who did the background research so that our officers and those who were going to go work, specifically our consultants with that congregation, would have some background info before they had their conversation. Spent a ton of time on church websites. Here's what I know. First, you're going to know when the Sunday school starts. That's always on the front page. You're going to know when the next youth lock-in is. That's usually on the front page too. You might know about a fall harvest event. Occasionally, you'll find the address. That's not a given. Make sure you go back and check that, by the way. Sometimes you can find the service times. It might be hidden on another page. Almost never do they tell me the statement that Charity Water is about to. What is your real life breathing mission? What am I going to see when I walk through the doors of your congregation? What are the stories that people are going to tell about the transformational things that are happening in that place? So often we talk about getting more people in the pews on Sunday morning, and I have to say if I went out and talked to my millennial friends, inviting them to come and be in a pew on Sunday morning, they certainly wouldn't find that to be very interesting. Why are they coming? Why should they be there? What type of transformational work can we do together as a church community that I cannot do alone? Those are the stories I want to hear. So like any good millennial, I decided to put this up on Facebook. Why church? Nothing more than just that question, why church? I'm curious about the responses. And I put this on at 9 o'clock at night one night, got up the next morning and had about 14 different responses. And of course, a lot of people, usually seminary friends, trying to correct my question. Did I ask the right one? Let's take a look at the answers together, though. These are two of my favorites. Because the community holds me when I can't carry myself. And because it's a true gift to hold others in community when I feel strong. And the second one I really, really love. Because I want to hear that I'm forgiven, that I matter, and that I'm loved, even though at parts of this week I felt unlovable. Even though I'm not so sure about Jesus or God or the Holy Spirit sometimes. By the way, this is a first-call pastor. I love her vulnerability here. There's something at church that connects my story to a story bigger than me. A story my parents know, my spouse knows, a story my grandmother knew, a story Paul, Sarah, Ruth, and Jesus knew. God's story that keeps interrupting our lives and saturating our lives, all of our lives, all at the same time. It's about the stories. It's about the stories that we have to share. If you want to tell your why story, absolutely create a one-sentence mission statement. But then give me a couple of stories and pictures that go along with it. When I speak to larger groups like this and I have more time, often what we'll do together is we'll share our why stories. And generally what I force people to do is tweet it. They don't have to have a Twitter profile, but they have to keep it short, because us church people, we like to tell the whole long story. 140 characters or less. Give it a try at your next council, session, meeting, your committee meeting for stewardship. What is your why? Why do you give, or why church? I did this activity a few years back when I first started. We were up in the mountain regions in Pennsylvania in a church basement on a Sunday afternoon. It was a pretty small group, so I decided we'd write out our whys and each of us could go around and share our story. We got to the woman in the front row. She looked like your traditional stewardship leader, if you'll go along with me for a minute. Salt and pepper hair, taking very detailed notes. I could tell that she was very familiar with spreadsheets. And she wanted to share her why story. When we got to her, I said, will you please share? And instead of sharing her story, she looked up at me with frustration. Grace, I don't get why you're focusing on this why. Everybody knows why. I just want people to give. How do you get them to give? She was so frustrated. And I paused. And I asked her again, why church? Share with us your why church story. And she again exploded in frustration. Grace, I don't get it. People just aren't giving. I wish they could just give. This why stuff, it just doesn't matter. And so again, I asked her, why church? And for some reason, the third time was the charm. She waited for a minute, and she said something very similar to that first comment you see up there. Because when my husband died, this community gathered around me, and I cannot wait to gather around others. I get goosebumps every time I tell this story. It was so powerful, and I looked at her and I said, have you ever shared that story with people in your congregation? She said, no. I said, the first thing you need to do is go back and tell them that story. I want to end by sharing with you another story just from last week. A week ago, Thursday, I was sitting with the Texas Presbyterian Foundation with some pastors and ministry leaders and fundraisers from the Dallas area. And we were sharing our why stories. It was a group of about 20 of us, so again, we decided to go around the room. The tenor in the room completely changed when we shared our why stories. We started out by hearing from a pastor who said, church is the place where people pray for you when you can't pray for yourself. I said, tell us more about what that story was about. Give us the background. He said on his first Sunday at this congregation, his son became very, very ill, and they actually ended up leaving in an ambulance. Turns out that he had type 1 diabetes, and they spent his whole first week of ministry in the hospital, with other leaders of the community bringing him hot dishes and helping him as they were sitting in the hospital caring for their son. And someone said to him, Pastor, you don't need to preach the next Sunday. Let's find someone else to preach for you so you can rest. And he said, no, I want to preach. When he preached his sermon, he took a vulnerable step and said, I don't even know how to pray right now. I'm in such anguish and grief over what happened with my son. And afterwards, after he got down for the pulpit, thought, oh my goodness, I don't even know these people. How on earth did I just say this to them? And the council president came in the door of his office. Had no idea what to expect. He said to him, Pastor, we're so glad you said that for two great reasons. One, we can now pray for you. And two, a lot of us feel that way sometimes. And we're really glad that you own that story. You better bet that after that story was shared, we had another hand pop up from the back of the room, a pastor who had attempted suicide last year out of bipolar disorder and was grateful for the way that his Episcopal priest had journeyed with him through the process and advocated for him. Another man shared the story of his Good Samaritan passage, of a Baptist who came to save him when he was left for dead after a flash flood by the side of the road. Another man shared the story of his wife who had come back after an aneurysm in a miracle. Vulnerability begets vulnerability. When you start sharing the whys, it becomes contagious. And you'll be amazed at what stories are in your congregation that you may have never even heard before. So what should you do with your why? Share it on social media. Share it in your committee meetings. Share it as the next offering. Remind us all that God is still speaking in our world today, not just through the Bible, but through our own transformational stories.
So I get to follow that by talking about segmenting your message. Who put this together? The last what's new that we want to talk about is something that some of you may already be doing, and certainly we're seeing more and more congregations doing that. And that is to say that when you ask people to do something, whether it's give or volunteer time or talents, whatever, it's really only the local congregation that would ever think about one size fits all. All other nonprofits are going to be tailoring a message to specific audiences. And we're seeing more and more congregations that are doing that. This is Lord of Life, where I spend a bit of time and where my wife and I love to worship. Over the last 3 years, we have segmented our message in our annual stewardship program in the fall in 3 different ways. The first year that I was there, we were coming off of a capital campaign. And we were inviting people who had given to the capital campaign to take what they were giving to had been giving to the capital campaign and combine that with what they were giving for the regular ministry of the congregation and to grow their giving by putting two things together. So we had a message for those people. There were other people who hadn't given anything to the capital appeal, so that message would have made no sense to them. So we had a different message for them. So that was the first year. The second year, we segmented the message based on how much people had given. So we took the top 100 givers, and they got a letter. We took people who hadn't given anything in the last 3 years. They got a different letter. Because we figured the appropriate message for one of the top 100 givers and the appropriate message for somebody who hadn't given in the last 3 years was very, very different. Some things we do in common. We have mailings that go out to everybody. But when we get to that specific ask, then that gets segmented. This year, I was just working on these with our communications person yesterday before I left. We're segmenting based on how people give. So we have electronic giving. That's a big thing in our congregation. We've got a letter to people who give electronically. We've got a different letter for people who have pledged but written out the check. That's me. And then we have another letter for people who have done neither. So it's not a lot of work, but we think that segmenting that message helps us get an appropriate message out to a variety of people that if we tried to do one size fits all, just wouldn't work. So we thought it would be fun, as we conclude now, to think about another way of segmenting, which would be generationally. So as you heard, this is my unhappy time of the year when I'm 40 years older than Grace. So I'm at the not kind of at the top end, I'm at the top end of the boomers, and she's not. In a couple of weeks, she has a birthday, so then it's only 39 years difference, and I'm happier. So we thought it would be fun to just take a look at what if you segmented generationally, and I know that I don't represent all boomers any more than Grace represents all the people in her generation, but we thought it might be just kind of fun to think about 3 statements. So here we go.
So we're going to use the lens of 3 statements. The first one is, one thing I'd like you to know about my financial situation. The big thing for me and for many of my peers is student loan debt. Now, this is something that does not just affect millennials. It certainly affects Gen Xers. It affects baby boomers who are paying for their child's education, often at the expense of their retirement. My student loan debt, my husband and I's, is more a month than our mortgage. And you better bet that it hinders our capacity to be as generous as we'd like to be with our congregation and other nonprofits. I often dream of the day when we'll have no student loan debt and we actually have the freedom to be as generous as we'd like to be. Currently, I think we're able to live into our generosity somewhat, but I look forward to that time. The one other thing I want to let you know about, especially for my first call pastors who are in the room, this is not just college debt. This is seminary debt. If your pastor isn't able to talk openly about money, it may be because of the debt burden that's placed on them. They may not be able to be as generous as they want to be because of that debt. How do we start talking about this openly? Not just as an issue that affects some people, but as a justice issue in our world today.
A lot of my peers like to say, well, I am living on a fixed income after all. I would say I've lived on a fixed income my whole life. It's been called my salary. We all live pretty much on a fixed income. Unless you're operating on straight commission, you're more or less on a fixed income. I'm very aware that there are people in my generation whose income is fixed fairly low and for whom that is very stressful. I don't want to ignore that. But I also know that there are a lot of people in my generation whose income is fixed at a level that is just fine, thank you. My wife and I find ourselves now at a point where we can be more generous than we have ever been in our lives. And we are, and we're having a blast. We don't have kids to raise. We don't have college to think about for those kids. We're at a point now where certainly we have some ongoing financial obligations, but they're nothing compared to what they have been for most of the rest of our lives. Our income is actually down a little from what it was when we were working, but our ability to give generously is up dramatically. So if you hear my peers saying, well, I am on a fixed income after all, be polite, but don't let that put you off and imagine that they don't have the capacity to be generous in ways that maybe, like me, they've never been able to be generous before.
So our next statement is, here's how I'd like for you to ask me, particularly to volunteer. For me, it's let me break the mold. So often, stewardship teams will come up and ask me, Grace, I'd really love to have some young energy on our stewardship team. And very often, to translate that, what it means is Marilyn, who's been doing this ministry for 30 years, is retiring, and she's the one who always did the pledge cards, and we want someone to come in and just do the pledge cards. Fill in exactly for what Marilyn's role was. That's not exciting, probably, to many people, because they are not Marilyn. I want to be able to break the mold. Oftentimes, people have asked me about time and talent sheets. I think they're wonderful, but they usually don't fit into the framework of my life right now. My husband and I do a lot of traveling, so we can't come to committee meetings on a weekly or bi-weekly or even a monthly basis. But we have skills and gifts that we would love to offer. How could you use a public speaker in your congregation? How could you use a photographer? That's what my husband's gifts and skills are in your congregation. It certainly doesn't fit neatly into the time and talent sheet. But what if instead of asking me to join your team, you said, what skills, gifts, and passions do you have to offer? And how can we help you find a way to plug that in to your congregation? I also invite you that when you do have young adults join your committee, or people of all ages, allow them to ask questions. Don't bite them into a complete story that they're invited to finish off the ending to just in the way that you want them to. The way we've always done it doesn't work anymore. Allow them to ask questions and pair the old with the new.
3 or 4 months ago, I asked Steve to join our church's endowment fund board. And I went up, I caught him on Sunday morning and said, Steve, here's what I would like to ask you to consider. And he said, well, why me? And tell me exactly what you want me to do. The why me question, I think, was really important. You probably know the people my age in your congregation pretty well. We want you to tell us why me. What is it about my unique set of gifts and skills that caused you to want to ask me to do this? I think that we are not likely, I'm not sure anybody is likely, to respond very quickly to an announcement in the bulletin. I've always operated under the theory that the more people you ask to do any one job, the less likely you are to get any yeses. Whereas if you come and do a one-on-one, you're probably going to be much more successful. And I think my generation wants to know why me. What is it about me that you think is a good fit for this? And I have to tell you, his wife was standing there, and her response was, Steve, just say yes. I want you out of the house every once in a while. But tell us why me.
So to finish up this segment section, here's one thing you think you know about me that just might not be true. The thing that people often paste on me as an assumption, knowing that I'm a 29-year-old woman, is that I am not generous. And the statement that I hear so often from folks when I talk about millennials in ministry is that they are not generous. And the fact is, it's just not true. There's research after research after research, data upon data out there that illustrates that millennials are some of the most generous generations out there by percentage. But most of their giving is not going to their congregations. Why is that? I think it's often because we haven't shared our why stories. I've heard from so many millennials like myself who say they're not even sure what they're supposed to give to their congregation. I led a giving group at Lutheran Seminary when I was on staff there, and we had a group of 15 in the room. We were a giving circle, and we wanted to give money to a cause. And I asked them all where they currently gave to. 15 seminary students. Everybody gave to NPR. Everybody. Every single one. Almost no one mentioned a congregation. But we had a whole list of 10 different places that these people gave to. I wondered why. Why are they not giving there? And yet here they are being incredibly generous. Have a conversation about giving and stewardship in your congregation that doesn't have an ask included in it. That's what I encourage you to do. Allow people to talk about how and why they give so that others can follow in that example. Many of my millennial peers have no idea where to start with church giving. They appreciate NPR because they tell me to be a sustainer, I need to give $5 a month. I've got a place to start. Help me find that good starting place with you.
I'm not ready to coast. A lot of people think that people my age are. You know, we're ready to let everybody else do it. We had our turn, now it's your turn. I think there's been some people that have said that, but I don't think that's the majority opinion. I am not ready to admit that my golf game isn't as good as it was 20 years ago. Why in the world would I want to not be engaged like I was 20 years ago? I think that people my age we're looking for stuff to do. We've got more free time than we've ever had. But most of us want more out of life than doing crossword puzzles and playing golf. I'm not ready to coast. I'm not even close. All right.
So I get to end the presentation by sharing with you another example of segmentation. The thing that I love about this congregation's story, St. Stephen's in Bloomington, Minnesota, is that they do a great job of pairing the old with the new. They decided to do a capital campaign just to sustain funds for their mortgage. I thought it was a pretty shocking idea, to be honest. Most capital campaigns I know of are to add new additions, exciting new projects, and here they were just sustaining. But they decided to do it. Phase 1, they did the old model of capital campaigns. They had a congregation member pay for a country club-style dinner. People came in as speakers, myself included, and we invited these leadership donors to start out with their leadership gifts, and then they went back to the congregation and asked for pledges. Their goal was to reduce their mortgage. But then they had phase 2, because they realized that in order to really sustain St. Stephen over the long term, they needed to help these younger families who often were not giving to their congregation to step up to the plate. So instead of having a goal of how much money they wanted to raise, they had a goal of how many people they wanted to give sustaining gifts. And they had a 30-something who was a consultant who often worked with places like Apple come onto the team and share some pretty crazy new ideas for St. Stephen's. He wanted to lead a crowdfunding campaign. They started a completely different website for giving to this fund. He created 4 different videos about St. Stephen's ministry that they showed on Sunday mornings to bring in these new givers, to help them see why their giving was important in the ways that they wanted to hear it. Both of these phases were incredibly successful. Oftentimes, people think that when you want to bring in what's new, you have to give up what's old. And in fact, I think most times they work well together, not just separately. So what's right for you? Well, as you know, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Every single person in this room is going to take away something different for their context. But if I can encourage you to do 2 last things, please talk to people in your congregation. Don't just sit around with your stewardship team or your council and talk together of what you think those people might want. Talk to those people. Talk to the new millennials who come into your congregation. Talk to the young families. Ask them how they'd like to be involved, how they'd like to give. Don't just implement electronic giving because it's the cool new thing on the block. You may very well have young adults in your congregations who love to write checks. Ask people how they'd like to give, why they'd like to give, and how they want to plug into your community. I know they'll be so grateful that you asked. And I think in the process, you'll form a lot more empathy for those people who don't seem to be giving. And then I invite you to try something new. Maybe even partner with some of those people that you talk to really start something new in your congregation. Give yourself permission to experiment and to fail forward and learn more about yourself. Thank you so much for this time here. We really appreciate being able to be here.
Thank you.